When people think about aging, they worry about losing their memory. But what almost no one realises is that one of the strongest protectors of your brain isn't puzzles or supplements or even genetics. It's actually your muscle. We've been conditioned to think about brain health in isolation, as though cognitive decline happens independently from the rest of the body. But the reality I've seen working in emergency medicine is that the brain doesn't age in a vacuum. The state of your muscles, how much of them you have and how strong they are, directly influences how well your brain functions as you get older. And when I say directly, I actually mean there are measurable biological mechanisms linking muscle tissue to cognitive performance, to memory formation, and your resistance to Alzheimer's. My name's Dr. Alex, and over the last 10 years working in emergency medicine, I've become obsessed with the patterns behind who ages well and who doesn't. I've watched literally tens of thousands of older patients come through the department over the years, and what determines who stays sharp and who becomes confused isn't always what you'd expect. So in this video, I want to share what I've learned about how muscle protects your brain and give you the insights that I give to my own family. So the first thing to understand is that your brain age and your chronological age aren't the same thing. Two people born on the exact same day can have brains that function as though they are decades apart. One might have a sharp memory, quick thinking, good decision-making capacity, but the other might struggle with recall. They might get confused more easily. They might take longer to process information. They might not be able to leave the house. What separates them isn't just look or genetics, although clearly those do play a role. What separates them is something called cognitive reserve, which is essentially the brain's resilience against damage and stress. Think of cognitive reserve a bit like the health of the battery in your phone. Now, two phones purchased the same day don't hold charge the same way 10 years later. One of the phones might get you through a full day, but the other might die by lunchtime. The difference is how much strain the battery's been under, how it's been maintained, what conditions it's been operating in. Well, your brain works in a similar way. Some brains have been built up with protective factors that buffer against the natural wear and tear of aging, but others have been depleted by inflammation, poor metabolic health, lack of stimulation. And muscle, surprisingly, is one of the most powerful modulators of that reserve. What this means in practical terms is that brain aging is modifiable. You're not locked into a trajectory just because of how your family history is or how old you are right now. The biological mechanisms that determine whether your brain stays sharp or deteriorates are happening constantly, and many of them are influenced by what you do with your body. Muscle sits right at the center of this process, and the pathways through which it protects your brain are some of the most well-studied in all of aging research. And just before we move on to the next section, if you've watched a number of my videos and you found them useful, then please consider subscribing to the channel. It really makes these videos reach more people who might benefit from them. Thank you so much, I really do appreciate it, and let's carry on with the video. So, when you contract a muscle under load, when you're pushing against resistance, something really fascinating happens at the molecular level. Your muscles don't just generate force, they release signaling molecules called myokines into your bloodstream. These molecules travel throughout your body and they have effects on nearly every organ system. But one of the most profound impacts is on the brain. One myokine in particular, called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, it acts like fertilizer for your neurons. BDNF promotes the growth of new neural connections. It strengthens existing synapses, the little gaps between cells, and it supports the survival of brain cells that would otherwise die off. It's essential for learning, for memory consolidation, for maintaining cognitive flexibility as you age. Without adequate BDNF, your brain becomes less plastic, less able to adapt and form new pathways. And here's where muscle comes into this. Resistance training, the kind where you're lifting weights or working against meaningful resistance, what that does is it significantly increases BDNF production. More than walking, more than just light activity, and in some studies, more than aerobic exercise alone. The signal your brain receives when you train with resistance is different from other forms of exercise. It's a signal that says the body is being challenged, that adaptation is required, that systems need to be upgraded. And the brain responds by becoming more capable of change. It sounds fancy, but this isn't speculative. This has been measured in human trials. Older adults who start strength training show improvements in executive function, in processing speed, in memory performance. And when researchers actually measure BDNF levels, they rise in parallel with those cognitive gains. What's important to grasp is that this isn't about aesthetics or even strength for its own sake. The reason muscle contraction matters so much for brain health is that it's one of the most reliable ways to trigger these neuroprotective pathways. You can't supplement your way into this effect. You can't think your way into it. You have to create the physical demand that tells your body to invest in brain resilience. Now, moving beyond BDNF, there's another mechanism that ties muscle to brain aging, and it has to do with inflammation. Now, chronic low-grade inflammation, which I talk about all the time, the kind that builds up quietly over years, is one of the strongest drivers of cognitive decline. It damages blood vessels in the brain, it disrupts the blood-brain barrier, it promotes the accumulation of proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease. Inflammation accelerates almost every degenerative process we associate with an aging brain. Now, muscle tissue, when it's metabolically active and regularly stimulated, functions as one of the body's largest anti-inflammatory organs. But the key phrase there is when it's used. Muscle at rest, especially when muscle mass is low, doesn't provide this benefit. In fact, people with low muscle mass tend to have higher baseline levels of inflammatory markers like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha. The less muscle you have, the less equipped your body is to regulate inflammation. And that systemic inflammation doesn't stay confined to your joints or your arteries. It travels to your brain. The myokines released during resistance training have direct anti-inflammatory effects. They literally counteract the signals that promote inflammation. They help to regulate immune function. They reduce the oxidative stress that damage cells throughout the whole body. This creates a protective buffer for the brain, reducing the chronic inflammatory load that would otherwise accelerate neurodegeneration. And this protection compounds over time. Someone who maintains their muscle mass and trains consistently through their 40s, their 50s and their 60s is essentially running a lower inflammatory state than someone who doesn't. And that difference shows up in brain aging. What makes this particularly relevant in emergency medicine is that inflammation is a massive risk factor for delirium. We see delirium every single day. Delirium is that acute state of confusion that you see in hospitals where someone becomes disorientated, they become agitated, unable to think clearly. It's often triggered by an infection, by surgery, or just a general illness or a change in their surroundings, but not everyone exposed to those triggers becomes delirious. The people most vulnerable are those with existing brain fragility, and chronic inflammation is a major contributor to that fragility. So muscle, by controlling inflammation, doesn't just protect against long-term dementia risk, it protects against acute cognitive failure under stress as well. There's a third pathway worth understanding at this point, and it connects muscle tissue to brain health through your metabolism. So your brain is an incredibly energy demanding organ. I've said this many times before, but it represents about 2% of your body weight, but consumes roughly 20% of your glucose and oxygen. For the brain to function well, it needs a stable, reliable energy supply. And muscle is one of the key regulators of how efficiently your body handles glucose. When you have adequate muscle mass and you use it regularly, that's really important. Your insulin sensitivity improves massively. Muscle tissue is one of the largest glucose sinks in the body, meaning that it pulls glucose out of the bloodstream and stores it as glycogen. What this does is that it keeps blood sugar stable. It reduces insulin resistance and it ensures that your brain has consistent access to fuel without the metabolic chaos that comes from chronic hyperglycemia or erratic glucose swings. Insulin resistance, when left unchecked, doesn't just lead to type 2 diabetes, it affects the brain directly. There's now substantial evidence that insulin signaling in the brain is critical for memory and cognition, and that impaired insulin signaling contributes to Alzheimer's disease. In fact, some researchers refer to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes because of how closely the two conditions are linked metabolically. The neurons in your brain need insulin to function properly, and when insulin resistance develops, those neurons become less efficient, more prone to damage, more likely to accumulate with plaques and tangles associated with dementia. Muscle, by improving your metabolic health, protects your brain from this metabolic dysfunction. It's not just about preventing diabetes, although that's obviously important. It's about ensuring that the brain's energy systems continue working as they should, that neurons remain responsive to insulin, that glucose delivery to the brain stays stable. This is why people with better metabolic health in midlife have lower dementia risk later on, and why maintaining muscle mass is one of the most effective metabolic interventions that anybody can make. Let me bring this to the clinical world for a moment, because this is where the abstract mechanisms become really visible. In the emergency department, we see patients come in with infections, with fractures, with complications from surgery all the time. Very often, they're older, but not always. And one of the things that we watch for closely is delirium, this acute confusion that I mentioned earlier. Not every patient develops it, even when the medical insult is similar. The patients who become confused the fastest, who lose orientation, who can't follow conversations or even remember where they are rarely the oldest. They're often the frailest. And frailty, at its core, is about low physiological reserve. Low muscle mass is one of the defining features of frailty. When someone has very little muscle, their body has fewer resources to buffer against stress. Their metabolic flexibility is reduced. Their inflammatory control is impaired. Their cardiovascular capacity is limited. And their brain, under the strain of illness, fails more easily. I've honestly seen this pattern thousands of times. Two patients with the same pneumonia, the same severity. One of them stays lucid, recovers steadily, but the other becomes agitated and confused within 24 hours. They take weeks to recover cognitively and sometimes never fully return to their baseline. The difference isn't the infection, it's the reserve that they had going into it. And muscle mass, along with the metabolic and inflammatory resilience it provides, is one of the strongest predictors of who has that reserve. This isn't just about hospital outcomes, although those clearly are important. It's actually a window into what's happening more gradually over years. If your brain can't handle the stress of an acute illness without decompensating, then that tells you something about its underlying fragility. The same processes that cause delirium under stress are the ones that drive cognitive decline over time. Building muscle builds the buffer that protects you in both scenarios. Now, when we step back and look at large population studies, the connection between muscle and brain health becomes even clearer. Research tracking people over decades has consistently found that those with greater muscle strength in their midlife years have significantly lower rates of dementia later in life. I've mentioned grip strength a few times before, but this is a simple proxy for overall muscle function. It's emerged as one of the strongest predictors of cognitive decline. People with weaker grip strength at age 50 or 60 are far more likely to develop Alzheimer's or vascular dementia by their 70s or 80s. This isn't just correlation. When researchers control for other factors like education, their income, cardiovascular disease, the relationship persists. Muscle mass and strength appear to have an independent protective effect on the brain, and the direction matters massively. People who lose muscle mass rapidly in their 60s and 70s show steeper cognitive decline than those who maintain it. The rate at which you lose muscle, not just how much you have, predicts how quickly your brain ages. What's really encouraging about this data is that it points to a window of opportunity. The decisions that you make about physical activity, about resistance training, about maintaining muscle mass in your 40s, 50s, and 60s have implications for your brain decades later. This isn't about trying to reverse dementia once it's established, it's about reducing the likelihood that it develops in the first place. And the evidence suggests that muscle is one of the most modifiable risk factors that you have control over. The relationship works both ways as well. People with better cognitive function tend to stay more physically active, which helps them maintain muscle. So there's a virtuous cycle where muscle supports the brain and a functioning brain supports the behaviors that preserve your muscle. Breaking into that cycle early by building strength before decline accelerates gives you the best chance of maintaining both. One of the most damaging beliefs about brain aging is that it's inevitable and irreversible, that once you're past a certain age, cognitive decline is just something you have to accept. But neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections and adapt, persists well into old age. It slows down, yes, but it doesn't stop at all. And strength training is one of the most effective ways to enhance neuroplasticity in older adults. Studies have actually shown that older people who begin resistance training, even if they've been sedentary for years, show improvements in executive function within months. Executive function is this collection of cognitive processes that let you plan, let you focus, remember instructions, juggle multiple tasks. It's what declines first in many neurodegenerative conditions, and it's what strength training appears to protect most effectively. The improvements aren't subtle. We're talking about measurable gains in cognitive testing, faster processing speeds, better working memory. What this tells us is that you're not just preserving the brain you currently have, you're actively upgrading it. The neural pathways you strengthened through resistance training, the BDNF you generate, the inflammation you suppress, these don't just slow decline, they create improvement. Honestly, you can genuinely lower your biological brain age, not just in a metaphorical sense, but in terms of how your brain performs relative to your chronological age. This sense of inevitability and giving up around brain aging often comes from watching older family members decline and just assuming that that's predetermined. But much of what we attribute to normal aging is actually the result of disuse, of poor metabolic health, of chronic inflammation. All the things that are modifiable. The brain ages differently depending on how you treat your body, and muscle is one of the most powerful levers that you have to influence that direction. So if muscle protects your brain, then what does effective training actually look like? Well, the focus needs to be on resistance, not just movement. Walking, as I've mentioned in previous videos, is highly valuable. Cardio has enormous benefits, but the unique stimulus that builds muscle and triggers the neuroprotective mechanisms we've just discussed comes from working against meaningful resistance. What that means is lifting weights, using resistance bands, body weight exercises where you're challenging your muscle to adapt. Frequency matters less than consistency. Training 2 to 3 times per week is enough to see significant benefits, provided the sessions are structured well. Compound movements, these exercises that use multiple muscle groups, should form the core of your training. We're talking squats, deadlifts, presses, rows. These movements not only build muscle efficiently, but they also require coordination, they require balance, proprioception, all of which engage your brain in ways that isolated exercises don't. The key to all of this is progression. Your muscles adapt when they're challenged beyond what they're used to. Now, that doesn't mean training to failure every session or lifting maximally, but it does mean gradually increasing the load, the volume, or the difficulty over time. Stagnation won't give you the stimulus needed to maintain the neuroprotective effects. The adaptation, the continued demand for your body to get stronger, is what keeps the beneficial mechanisms active. And as we reach the end of this video, there's a few persistent myths around exercise and brain health that prevent people from taking the right approach. One of them is this belief that cardio alone is enough. Cardiovascular exercise is excellent for brain health. It improves blood flow, it supports your vascular health, it has its own cognitive benefits, but it doesn't build muscle the way that resistance training does. And without adequate muscle mass, you're missing a critical protective factor. The two are complementary, not interchangeable. Another myth is that it's too late to make a difference, that if you're already in your 60s or 70s or 80s, then strength training won't move the needle. Well, the research says otherwise. Some of the most dramatic improvements in both strength and cognitive function have been seen in these people who were previously sedentary. Your brain and muscles remain responsive to training far later than most people assume. Starting at 70 is better than starting at 75, but starting at 75 is infinitely better than not starting at all. And finally, there's this belief that brain decline is purely genetic, that if dementia runs in your family, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, yes, genetics do matter, particularly for conditions like early onset Alzheimer's, but for the vast majority of people, lifestyle factors are far more protective than genes. Even people with genetic risk factors can significantly reduce their dementia risk through modifiable behaviours, and muscle maintenance is high on that list. If you step back and look at the totality of evidence, muscle emerges as one of the most underappreciated protectors of your long-term brain health. It's not the only factor. Obviously, things like sleep, nutrition, social engagement is a big one, managing cardiovascular risk, all of these matter. But muscle is uniquely powerful because it influences so many of the pathways that drive brain aging. It regulates inflammation, it stabilizes metabolism, it stimulates neuroplasticity, it builds physiological reserve. It doesn't just affect how your body functions, it affects how your mind functions. The patients that I see in the emergency department who've maintained their strength, who've kept muscle mass into older age, are the ones who stay orientated, who recover faster, who walk out of the hospital with their cognition intact. The ones who've lost muscle, who've become frail, are the ones that we worry about. Not because they're at risk of falls or fractures, although that's part of it, but because their brains are more vulnerable to any kind of stress, whether that's an infection, an operation, or just the accumulated burden of aging. Strength training isn't just about looking younger. It's not primarily about aesthetics or even physical performance, although those are nice byproducts. It's about thinking clearly, staying yourself, remaining capable of independent thought and decision making for as long as possible. It's about protecting the thing that makes you who you are. And if muscle is your longevity organ, like I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, then this is one of the most important reasons why. Your brain depends on your muscle more than you've been told, and the time to build that protection is now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I really hope this video inspired you. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.